So I'm very pleased to introduce Nick Enfield. And in thinking how to introduce him, I want to make the quick point of how important language is in what we do here in pro-social world, both theoretically and empirically. We treat language and in general symbolic systems as the cultural equivalent of our genes. And a lot of the methodology we use is derived from acceptance and commitment therapy and relational frame theory, a framework which, in my experience, is awesome in the first place, but very little known beyond its borders in the second place. And Nick represents, I think, the study of language much more generally, because the study of language, of course, is huge and sprawling and multidisciplinary, and even goes back before Darwin. And so Nick is a professor of linguistics at the University of Sydney. I spent a lot of time at the Max Planck Institute as a staff scientist at the Institute of Psycholinguistics. His specialty is mainland Southeast Asia, especially Laos. And he has a long string of books. I won't mention them all. I'll only mention the last two. Consequences of Language, From Primary to Enhanced Intersubjectivity, and Language versus Reality, Why Language is Good for Lawyers and Bad for Scientists. And so, Nick, I think you're going to talk to us about one of your most recent pieces of work. And then I think one reason that we have these sessions 90 minutes is so that we could really explore things widely, bring in still more in the extended Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much. In just a moment, I'll share my screen so you can see some slides. And but first, just to say thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to see all of you. Please let me know if you need me to stop, and please jump in if you need me to clarify any kind of point. It's intended not to be a kind of technical talk about language, but there may well be things here and there that people would want to sort of ask me to elaborate on. So feel free to jump in. I don't know what the usual practice is here, but don't feel reluctant or shy.
Yeah. Typically we wait, Nick, for the seminar unless we have a clarification questions, and then commence with the Q&A. So
absolutely fine. Whatever you need, that's absolutely fine. So yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I'll basically just go into the slides now, and I've got a little bit of preamble there, and we'll just get started. Let me share my screen. Okay. So I'm just going to minimize my own face up in the corner there. Good. So you're able to see and hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Good. All right. Well, I'll just proceed. So as David was saying, there are a number of kind of works that I could have drawn on here. So I've been working for quite a long time on thinking about language, well, in a lot of different ways, but ways that for this audience, ways that touch on kind of evolutionary questions. So thinking especially about language as a larger system, as a system with dependencies within it. So some of those works, the two books in green there, kind of touching on those questions of language as a kind of a process and a system at the same time. The book How We Talk has actually quite a few sort of evolutionary ruminations in it. It really focuses on how language is a kind of glue for social interaction, which is something nowadays that I always come back to, and I think is crucial in evolutionary questions. The Language versus Reality book, which recently came out, is really about what language is good for, essentially. And I think that's a really important factor in thinking about how we want to account evolutionarily for language. So the argument there is that really language is good for persuasion, justification rather than, capturing the truth of our experiences. David just mentioned consequences of language as well, which is really looking at how, since the innovation of language in our species, how we have had to adapt to language, or how language has changed us, if you like. So there's quite a number of things that could be really interesting to this group. But what I'm actually going to talk about is sort of ends up in some of that space, but is something that I've written quite recently. And it's this work on scale in language. So it's a paper that is about to appear in Cognitive Science. As you can see, I've just had the proofs come through. So this is sort of fresh off the press, as it were. And it's part of a larger ongoing project and represents something of a work in progress. So not this paper itself, obviously it's finished, but the larger project that it's part of. So I'd be very grateful for your comments and suggestions as to how to develop it. So as a kind of prelude, a question that often comes up when we're thinking about language is whether it is something like an organism. And I should note there's a kind of slippage between the idea of asking about language as a general sort of capacity versus asking about languages as specific linguistic systems like French and Japanese and English. Mostly today, I'm going to be talking about the second one, talking about, language systems that we need to learn and that we use. What kind of a thing is a language system? So for a long time, people have very naturally applied a kind of an organism metaphor, if you want to think of it as a metaphor. Maybe it's not a metaphor, but certainly people write that way. Languages are organisms. Languages live and die. They have fruit and so forth. And this is not just an old way of talking. There's a quote, number 3 there, from Christensen and Chater, 2008. We view language itself as a complex and interdependent organism which evolves under selectional pressures from human learning and processing mechanisms. So there's always been a very attractive sort of framing of language there, which is the idea that it's sort of, a language is like a species, and languages vary in interesting ways, and we can think about that evolutionarily. And one recent sort of twist on that, in some sense, is the idea of talking about languages as complex adaptive systems. So several authors have started to develop that idea over the last sort of 20 years or so. And I think it's a really interesting one. One thing I would note about it is it's not really got much traction in linguistics itself as yet. And I think that's beginning to change. Coming in from cognitive science is beginning to have an effect slowly, but it hasn't got that much traction yet. So I'm interested in developing that idea and looking at ways in which we can apply it usefully. And there's a kind of challenge with thinking about language as a complex system, and that is that, so there's a widely cited paper by Beckner et al., which is it's a position paper on this idea, and this is a direct quote from that paper: everything is connected. And I find this statement a little bit paralyzing, to be honest, because, if everything's connected, where do we start? So I've often had a sort of a sympathy for the idea of language as a complex system, but never quite known how to kind of get a grip on it. So I've been looking for what I call conceptual hooks, and the one that I've been grappling with is the idea of scale. And this was really inspired by reading this book by Geoffrey West, which came out, I think, in 2017. So he directed the Santa Fe Institute for some time, and is well known in physics circles, but it did a lot of really interesting collaborations around questions of growth and sustainability of large systems. And the book, highly recommended, looks at growth in biological systems, growth in economies, and so forth, and applies some really foundational concepts of scale, which what I've done in this study is to try to sort of see how they apply to language. So the basic kind of idea here is not just that things can be bigger or smaller, but that there are different ways in which parts of a system will get bigger or smaller relative to each other. So a really simple illustration is the square cube law. So you could take a solid with two solids here, one on the left, one on the right. And let's say we want to maintain the proportions of this solid and just increase the length of it by 3. So we're going to, it has consequences for other sort of dimensions of this solid. So the height will also have to get multiplied by the same multiplier. So the height becomes 3 times higher. But the surface area grows as the square of the multiplier and not just the multiplier, and the volume grows as the cube of the multiplier. So that has all sorts of consequences for design. So if you've looked at Richard Dawkins' recent book on flight, this is one of the sort of most important points in the evolution of flying creatures, is that they're all generally pretty small. And that has to do with the ratio between surface area and mass as a constraining factor here. So scale is not just, it's not just that a small thing can become a big thing, but that different parts of a system will change at different rates as you scale things up. So one of the big themes in West's book is the scale of body mass in mammals. And there's very big variance, just going by, weight in kilograms, something like 8 orders of magnitude from, shrews to blue whales at different ends of this scale. And so you can see this idea of different parts of the system scaling at different rates. A term for this is allometric scaling. In different aspects of the system. So a simple example would be just looking at the size or the mass of the legs in relation to the overall mass of the body. And what you see here is that so linear scaling would just be like what we saw with the square, that if you scale up one side of the square, the other side of the square scales in a straight line. So the dotted line here would just be a linear scaling relation between two parts of a system. But in this case, what we see is that the leg size, so every time the body size gets bigger, the leg size gets bigger too, but the legs get bigger at a faster rate. So you see that, relative to the body, once you get to the size of an elephant, you've got to have very chunky legs to deal with, the overall structure hanging together. And in the book by Geoffrey West, he has a discussion of what shape Godzilla would have to have. So if you had a human-shaped, shaped mammal that was the big size of a 10-story building, they would not be able to stand up. So they'd have to have legs that were bigger than their own torso in order to sort of stand up, and that would be. So there are these relations set important limits on how systems can develop and grow. So the observations of these kinds go back. One of the kind of most important references in the West story is these observations about basal metabolic rate and its relationship to body mass. So this is just another plot of the same kind that you just saw, where you can plot the increase in body mass against the increase in metabolic rate, but it's not a linear relation. So it's what's called a 3/4 scaling relation. So that's to say that well, you see that little formula here in the caption of the figure. It's a 3/4 power relation, and that's a very robust. I mean, we're not getting into those technicalities here, but I want to point out. So this is an illustration from one of the papers by West that shows that this scaling relation occurs across it's not just from shrews to elephants and blue whales, but going all the way down to the cell structure to very, very tiny scales. You're getting a similar scaling relation. And his work, which we're not going to say more about today, was really more all about trying to understand why is there this consistent 3/4 power scaling relations across all of these sort of different scales of life. So I recommend looking at his book to see what his answer is. I want to give another example, which I think is a little bit more accessible, and that is the same kind of sublinear scaling that occurs in cities in relation to how many gas stations are found in each city. So these plots show on the x-axis just the population of each. So each x is a town, and it's plotted by just its population, and the y-axis is just how many gas stations exist in that town. So as you can see, there's a positive correlation. The bigger the population, the more gas stations. But you see that the growth of gas stations is below that line, which means that they grow at a slower rate, which means that there's an economy of scale. So more persons per gas station in each city. And West's point is that this is not just a coincidence that it looks like the sublinear scaling of mammal circulatory systems. It's actually explained by the same principles, which we're going to get to a little bit later on. So let's look at language, and I'll give you an example of a something like, basically it's not a 3/4 power scaling relation, but it's a sublinear scaling relation that comes from language. So a simple example would be, languages that use the vocal channel, like the language I'm speaking now, have consonants and vowels. So of course, not all languages use sound. There are sign languages, but most languages use sound systems that have consonants and vowels. And there's a lot of research been done over the years on hundreds of languages showing that you pick a language out of a bag and you'll see that they'll have different numbers of consonants and vowels. So there's no language with one consonant and one vowel, and there's no language with 1,000 consonants and 1,000 vowels. The range is quite relatively narrow to that, but there's still some range. So you can find languages that have, where are we? For example, just 3 vowels, or 6 vowels, or 8 vowels, or 10 or 11 vowels. I mean, on the left and right side of these two figures, you've got what are called short vowels and long vowels. The 2 dots indicate long vowels. The basic point is that we can see that languages range quite a lot within a certain window in how many vowels they have. And the same is true for consonants. So you can take a language like Maori, which has just 3, it's a particular type of consonant called a stop consonant, like a P or a T or a K. And you can go to another part of the world, Sindhi in South Asia, and find not just 3 stop consonants, but 24 stop consonants. So again, a pretty high variance in just sort of scale of how many sounds are used in a system. How do these two things correlate? Well, we find something pretty similar to the gas stations story in cities, and that's that you get a sublinear increase in vowel systems relative to consonant systems. So if you pick a language out of a bag and you say, okay, how many consonants does it have? And you rank them according to how many consonants they have, you'll find that the consonants scale up with the vowels, but the vowels go up more slowly. So that's one example of a allometric scaling relation within a language system. And we'll come to some more of those later. We'll see how much time we have. So that's just to kind of introduce what kind of an analogy we might want to draw here in terms of linguistic systems. So a little bit of kind of also ground clearing here. I've been talking about scale so far, and I haven't mentioned the term complexity. And so some of you might have in mind, is he talking about complexity? Is this just the same thing? And I want to be clear that I don't mean scale to be the same thing as complexity. There's a lot to say about complexity, and I won't be saying a lot about it, but I would just want to register that there's multiple ways of thinking about complexity. I'll just mention 2 here. So one would be the degree to which a system can be what we call compressed. So that is to say the relationship between some data that we have about a system and how long our description would be of that data. So if we can describe something that has a lot of data points using a very small number of rules, then that's a relatively not complex system. That's a more simple system. So in language, it would mean, you know, a very regular sort of language where there's only a small number of rules would be a less complex language, whereas a language that has lots of exceptions would be regarded as more complex. So there's a sort of an orthogonal relationship with scale there. A second concept of complexity has more to do with uncertainty and how much a new fact about the system would surprise you or would be what you would have predicted. And so that's readily applied to language. So I can give you a simple example here. So many languages mark what's called number, and that just simply means whether there's a distinction like plural versus singular. So in French, for example, just like English, there's past and future. Singular and plural. A language like Lao, which is spoken in Laos, that's a language that I work on, has no marking at all for singular and plural. And Sanskrit has 3 distinctions. So many languages have a distinction between singular, plural, and then a third category, which is dual, for specifically 2 of an entity. So you might look at a system like that and say, okay, here's 3 types of language, and we can compare their complexity in terms of sort of what's the degree of uncertainty about what is going to happen at any given time. So you might say, okay, Lao has 0 complexity because it's 100% predictable. We know there's going to be no marking. And because French has 2 terms, it's going to be 50-50. And in Sanskrit has 3 terms, it's going to be, you know, a third of the time. It will be, you know, each selection of a number distinction is going to be surprising to a different degree because of the sort of size of the system. There's something very important about language to register here, which is that this is not the right way to think about uncertainty in language. One thing that's really important in language is frequency of usage, relative frequency of usage of any given sort of structural alternative. So it turns out that if you look at, if you collect a whole bunch of books or recordings of people actually speaking French or actually writing Sanskrit, you find that the frequencies with which people use those distinctions are highly skewed. So in French, even though there's 2 distinctions, you might say, oh, it's 50-50, you know, singular versus plural. Actually, it's 3 out of 4 times. You pick out a noun from a French bag of French words, it's going to be 3 out of 4 times it's going to be marked as singular, and only 1 out of 4 times it's going to be marked as plural. So when you compare the facts of frequency, you see that actually, you know, singular in French and Sanskrit has around the same degree of predictability. So that means that we can't just read off complexity from the number of features in a system. It's very important to look at how much kind of functional load goes on those parts of the system. All right. Now, just trying to think, I don't want to get bogged down in some of these points. I mean, quickly, I can say that frequency, you know, it'd be interesting to see what other people think from a kind of biological point of view, but frequency of usage of any part of a linguistic system is really fundamental to how we understand change in language and diversity of language across the world. So if you take another simple measure, you can see also very strong frequency effects. So all languages, roughly speaking, have the possibility of making simple sentences like Kim saw you, where you have a subject, you have a verb, and you have an object. And so there are 6 logical ways to order those 3 items. They're listed there. And so you might look at that and say, okay, well, I predict that if you go around the world and just randomly pick out languages, they'll be, you know, evenly distributed. But that's not true at all. They're very unevenly distributed. So you find here that the logical possibilities where the these ones here, where the subject comes first, are vastly more frequent. So these are really, so out of 1,300 something languages, 1,000 of them, or more than 1,000 of them, are just from these two possibilities here. So that's a very important consideration, and it also raises something that's crucial to thinking about language from a kind of evolutionary point of view, and that is that this heavy skewing towards one type of structure that you're seeing here is not just something that emerges from within a grammatical system. It's something that emerges historically and geographically through the history of the human populations who speak these languages. So this is data from the World Atlas of Language Structures, where each dot represents a language and each color represents what it's like on those 6 logical possibilities of how you order the elements of a sentence. And you can see there that there's these very strong bunchings of color. There's lots of green in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's lots of blue in South Asia and the Middle East, etc. And that comes about partly through historical relatedness of languages, but also through contact between languages and the influence that they have on each other. So it's a very, this kind of little excursion we've just been on, it illustrates a couple of really important points. And so one of them is that we don't just think about scale in terms of the number of slots in a structure, but with language, because it's a process, we have to think about frequency measures. The second thing that's really important is that we have to think about the fact that language is used by people. It's used in populations. It evolves through time, and so that invokes this kind of population thinking that's really important. All right, so I've just sort of drawn. I think the paper was pre-circulated and might be a little bit dry, so I'm not going to kind of just sort of go through all of these examples. What I do in the paper is I really review a bunch of ways in which, firstly, language can scale in various ways. So simply meaning what can we count in language such that we can see either great variation across languages or not very much variation. I mean, what sort of variance do we see and how much variance is there of that variance? And that's the first kind of big question I ask, and I'll just go through a few examples of those first. And then the second question that comes up then is, now that we've established ways in which languages can show system variance, scale variance, what dependencies do we see between those? And that's kind of really pointing to, I guess it's opening new questions that we can delve into in future work. So what I'll do is touch on a couple of those, and then at the end come back to some of the kind of proposed explanations that West et al. Suggests for their the systems they were looking at, and see how they might apply to language. Okay, so far so good?
Yep, great. Good,
okay. So just a few examples to do with scale variance. I mentioned sound systems. I just want to give you a little bit of a sense like what kind of range we're looking at. So you sample languages around the world. Scholars who've done this report, you can have vowel systems ranging as low as 3, not 1. You can have them going up to 40-something different vowels. Seems hard to imagine. I can explain what that would look like in the Q&A if you want. But that's radically high. Most languages are going to have about 5-6 vowels, something like that. And so you get a very strong kind of adherence to a core of frequency, but ranging around about 3 to 7, something like that, but then with a long tail at the high end. Roughly similar with consonants. I pointed out earlier that consonant systems get larger than vowel systems. But again, there's this range around us, a fairly limited range. You're seeing also in other sound structures range in how much information can be packed, how many segments of sound can be packed into a single syllable. So syllables are a very important structure. In sound systems, does a syllable just have one consonant and one vowel? Like in my dialect, car. Or, does it pack lots of sounds into one syllable, like strengths or something like that? Again, we find if you look at a sample of language, most of the time you're going to get quite small syllables and a long tail of possible kind of more large scale. If we move from sound systems to kind of other sorts of structure in language, we can go to, for example, texts. That would be a place to start. So how big can a text get? Well, that's where we see much radically different sort of degree of scale variance. So you can look at, for example, a one-word text like a stop sign. Shout out to Atlas Shrugged, this is for you. 500,000 words in a long novel. There are novels with 1 million words and so on. So there's many orders of magnitude variance in how big or small a text can be. Second, we've got a lot of variance between how big or small a specific unit of grammar can be. So I can refer to someone as he, I can refer to him as my brother-in-law, I can refer to him as my brother-in-law who you met at that party last week. You can take and in each case that would be, for example, the subject of a sentence. So it's one unit on one sort of level, but once you unpack it, you see that we can scale up or down what that unit consists of. And this is one of the kind of things that language is very good at, is using grammar to scale up and scale down the complexity of a single unit. So that's a fairly open. There's quite a lot of scale variance there, but again, a sentence might be 1 or 2 words, or it might be 10 or 20 words, but it's probably not going to be 1,000 words. Certainly not one that's spoken. But third, there's something sort of now that we're funneling down here to a unit where there's actually very little scalability, and that is kind of one of my favorite units of language, which is what's called the intonation unit. And that really refers to the bursts of sound that we use to deliver what are known as speech acts. So, as I speak now, or as anyone speaks when you're in just a natural conversation, if you record that and then you look at the timing of each thing that they say, you'll find that each sort of burst of speech is roughly around 2 to 2.5 seconds. Can be shorter, can be longer, but it's not going to be 3 minutes. So obviously there are constraints with how much air we can hold in our lungs to produce a breath group, as it's also sometimes called. But for other reasons, we really tend to closely limit our bursts of speech to these kind of intonation units, which are not very scalable at all. So we're seeing there in grammatical structures and units a very large degree of difference between how scalable these certain levels of structure might be. Then just quickly on these, we get grammatical classes. So I'm talking about things like within a language, you have these sort of little groups of words that go together. So for example, what we call demonstratives, that's words like this and that and yon meaning over there. All languages have words like this. And the range is usually between about 2 and 5. So it's a very small scaling range, it's very limited. If you then build up into looking not so much at grammatical words, but looking at words within lexical fields, you find that different languages will, the scale variance of the size of those fields is quite high across languages relatively. So if you look, for example, at how many words exist in a person's knowledge of plant taxa, so that's to say, how many tree species can you name? you'll find that in some languages, some communities, people are really not very good at this and they don't know very many tree species. But in other kinds of communities and people with other kinds of livelihoods, an average person might be able to name a few hundred species. So there are quite big scaling differences in across cultures, and to do with, let's say, the division of labor and knowledge that have to do with that relate to the size of these inventories of words. So that's scale variance in that takes us to scale variance in vocabulary. What I want to do is just jump straight to a different way of thinking about scale variance in vocabulary that brings us back to some sort of classic scaling research. So one way to think about how a vocabulary is arranged in terms of its scale is to just divide the vocabulary up into to categories and say, okay, we've got nouns, we've got verbs, I've got adjectives. You know, in your language, how many nouns are there and how many verbs are there and how many adjectives are there? And we can compare the sort of scale that way. And there are various problems with that. I mean, I think that's something worth doing and interesting, but I point out that it depends completely on the analyst's concept of what counts as a noun and what counts as a verb and what counts as an adjective, and that there's a lot of let's say controversy about that. A different way to approach it is to say, let's not try to create these classes, but just try to find the classes in the data. And how would we do that? Well, here's an example. This is from the work of Ziff in the first part of the 20th century, the creator of Ziff's law. So this is a kind of classic illustration of Ziff's law. What you see on this chart is, so the blue line is just War of the Worlds, the book. You just take all the words in that book and you just, for every word, you count how many times does it occur in the text. And once you've done that, then you have a ranking of all of the words. So the number one ranked word will be probably the, and then you just, rank all the words. So that's what's on the x-axis, and the y-axis is how much of the time, not just its frequency rank, but its actual frequency. And Ziff's law shows that there's this direct relation between the frequency of a word and its frequency rank. And it's a power law that just shows that the most frequent words in a language are very, very frequent. They take up a huge, you might have heard of Pareto distribution or sort of 80-20 rule, this kind of thing. The idea being that a small number of words take up most of the frequency of usage. So you find that, if you can learn 1,000 words in a language, then you're going to be hearing them most of the time. And then there's this very long tail of less frequent words. And it's a very robust effect. It's been found in many different languages. You see in this data, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 20, so like 30 plus languages. It's exactly the same procedure. You take a corpus of books or Wikipedia articles or something, and you just plot the most frequent to the least frequent words on one axis and the actual frequencies of them on the other axis, and you find this same line. What you probably noticed about the line on the right-hand side is that it is a little bit curved, right? And so sort of statistics nerds, I don't want to get too technical here, but I just point out if you look at this type of data that has a curve like that, you can say, well, okay, maybe it's not a curve. Maybe what you have is multiple exponents. So this is data. The red crosses represent words occurring in Wikipedia. So these are just English words. So this is the first ranked word, which is the, probably, and then going down. And this axis shows how much of the time they're used. But the point here is that the top group of words here on one exponent, this whole middle group of words here running down, are you seeing them? There, sorry, these ones here are on a second exponent, which is this green. And then there's a kink here, and all of these ones, on the blue line after about 10,000 words go on a different exponent. So I talk about this in the article, where these authors have looked at a large English corpus and said, okay, if we look at the distribution of words in a corpus, what we find is that this arrow here in the middle of that plot shows around about the point where we reach 5,000 words in a corpus. Okay, the 5,000, and I'm talking about 5,000 word types, so 5,000 different entries in the dictionary. And what that shows is that, they argue, is that a language will have a core vocabulary of about 5,000 words, which they call the kernel vocabulary. And basically, to be a native speaker of a language, you need to know those 5,000 words. And then after that, you get this long tail that has a different kind of shape to it. But it basically means that, if you are a specialist, if you're, a baker or a mechanic or an evolutionary biologist, you will have all of this very specific vocabulary that will fill that long tail. So leave the technicalities of this aside. The basic upshot of it is that languages have a kind of a non-scaling 5,000 word container at the core of their vocabulary. So once you've learned that amount of words in the language, you've saturated this kind of core container. And then you can build up the vocabulary in the language more and more as a learner. But then what you're doing is filling this specialized vocabulary, which is vocabulary that the person in the street or someone who's not from your sub-community should not be necessarily expected to know. So this, as you can see, this is a different way of dividing up the vocabulary, not through trying to define what's a noun, what's a verb, what's an adjective, but through actually drawing out these different containers of vocabulary from the data using these informational methods. All right. So looking then at sort of, vocabulary size, I want to put this in context of scaling across languages and how big or small languages can actually be. And this is something that's certainly been discussed a lot in the literature, is just, well, how much can we scale up the vocabulary of a language? And this is very contested and actually very hard to discern from the literature. I haven't tried to count how many words there are in English, but other people have. And they come up with pretty radically different answers. So the Oxford English Dictionary has something like 600,000 entries. I don't think anyone claims that any one human knows those words, so it's not really a realistic hypothesis about what a person who knows English must know. But below those three, that top estimation, you've got still wildly varying estimations of how many words an English speaker may know. Is it 200,000 or is it 17,000? Another thing to think about is, what about other languages? So English is a very exceptional language. It's been studied more than any other language. It's been written more than any other language. Well, the non-literate or the low resource languages of the world have been said by many to have very small vocabularies relatively. So for example, it's a quote from Guy Deutscher here. Linguists estimate that the average size of small languages is between 3,000 and 5,000 words. And other people kind of repeat this point. So there's a pretty strong claim that says, English has, 8 to 14 times more words than, a non-written language of the Amazon or something like this. So talk about this in the article and say, look, if, that would be interesting for a claim about scaling in language, but unfortunately it just doesn't, it's not really a realistic claim about language. If you look at non-written languages, it's true that if you go and pick up a dictionary, you're often going to find that they have about 5,000 entries. 3,000 to 5,000 entries would be probably average. Why do you think that might be? Well, it seems pretty obvious that a language like Nen, spoken in New Guinea, is being studied by, a researcher on his few sabbatical field trips, we're working with the consultants, and basically says, "I got to get this published." Whereas the Oxford Dictionary is being published over many decades, and I don't know, centuries, I suppose. And it's actually true that there are languages like Hawaiian and Tzotzil where authors have spent decades working and have shown that these languages don't stop at 5,000. These two dictionaries have something like 30,000 entries. So there's a really interesting open question there about vocabulary and to what extent you can actually see scaling in vocabulary. All right, I'm going to just skip over that for want of time. Because one thing I wanted to mention in terms of scale variance in language is the question of speaker population. So we've been talking about structure in language, how big is a certain subsystem of language, or how big is the vocabulary, but it's really important in a sort of any evolutionary thinking about language is to think about the populations that allow languages to circulate. And so there is another domain of language that we see massive scale variation. So, the logical possibilities are infinite, I suppose, but in practice, there are speakers that have, there are languages that have 1 or 10 or a few dozen or a few hundred speakers, many languages. In fact, the global median is around 8,000 speakers of the language. So, most languages don't have that many speakers, but a small, again, this is another sort of power law style distribution where a very small number of languages have massive populations like English and Chinese and Portuguese and Russian and French and so on. So that's a simple observation, is that scale variance in population size is very, very large. But I think it's worth putting this into perspective. Why we're interested in population size in terms of language evolution is that, we need to think about how language is distributed through human networks. So it is important to think in network terms here. And I just want to point out that human networks themselves have these very powerful kind of scaling properties. So Metcalfe's law is something that says that, that calculates or sort of states the relationship between the number of individuals in a network and the number of dyads, the number of two-person relationships between individuals in that network. So what you're seeing here is, let's just 4 little toy networks here. First one has 3 people. We're adding, 2 people, then 7 people, then 9 people. But you can see that the number of two-person relationships in these little networks rises at a much higher rate. So it's a quadratic scaling relation here. And you see immediately that as soon as you go to increase your network size, so this is a network of just 9 people, and you've got 36 possible conversations between 2 people. A population of 50, you've got more than 1,000. A population of 100, you double the population and you're getting, nearly 5,000 potential, conversational pairs. And once you're at a population of 5,000, which is, a large village, not even a small town, you've got 12 million potential conversational pairs. So that is, it puts a very, it has a very strong effect on how language can be. It means that for any network that's more than even the tiniest little family, the language has to be flexible enough to allow you to talk to someone who you've never spoken to before, or who, you really share no common ground with. And so it sets a very powerful constraint on the functionality of language. Also, what's really important is that not only the network size, but also the network topology, by which I mean, the structure of the network. So it's very rare that a network, well, it certainly doesn't occur with human networks, that every single person is linked to every other person. And Metcalfe's law shows that's impossible. But so what you do have is that different people in the population will be linked in different ways. So some people will have many links, some people will have small number of links, and those differences create a certain topology to the network, which we know has effects on the diffusion of innovation and therefore the diffusion of language. So those are a bunch of aspects of scale variance that that we've just sort of touched on, and I wanted to sort of unpack some of them and think about the range of variance you see across aspects of language, and also to point out, I suppose, that they're really very diverse. So there's different elements of language scale variance force us to look at really causally very diverse aspects of what a language system might look like. So we're looking on the one hand at sound systems, and we're looking at sort of vocabulary, then we're looking at population networks. These things, it's right for us to be doing that from a kind of complex systems point of view. And scale is allowing us a kind of a way of thinking about how we could think about those qualitatively very different causal domains in sort of, analogous ways. So to summarize those scale variances in a different way, we can say, well, okay, sometimes we're talking about very low variance. I mentioned the 2.5 second speech bursts that sort of allow us to interact. And we're getting, variance of 1 or 2 factors in certain parts of the language. We're getting 1 or 2 orders of variation in other parts of the language. And then with things like population size and text size, we're getting many orders of variance. Good. Okay, so that ends the sort of, and that's where I wanted to spend most of the time, is talking about the scale variance of various kinds. So what I want to do is to move towards wrapping up so we can have a conversation. And I'll just point to the paper itself where you can find a lot of the detail, but I'll just touch briefly on some of the scale dependencies. So the part we've just been through is talking about just, in what ways can scale be different in different parts of language? The next question is, in what way can any 2 measures be dependent on each other or correlate with each other in interesting ways? So I provide these tables in the paper and work my way through them. We won't go through them here, but I'll just pick out a couple of examples. So for example, in sound systems, the bottom row of this table shows that there's a correlation between how many different sounds there are in a language. We saw before that varies across languages, and how long the average word can be in that language. So there's a correlation between those 2 things. And there's a fairly straightforward explanation for that, and that is that, words are built out of sounds. Words have to contrast with each other. We need to have a lexicon of a certain size. We talked about the 5,000 word, core container of a vocabulary. So to sort of put these things in balance, you can see a causal relationship between them, and it helps to show why you've got a trade-off between, say, how many contrastive sounds we have in a system and how long the words have to be in a system. And that's something that's empirically supported around the world. Another example is what's called Menzerath's law. This is the top one on this table here. That's a correlation between the number of syllables in a word. So we see an illustration at the bottom of the screen here with these 3 words. So you've got a 1 syllable, a 2 syllable, and a 3 syllable word. These are obviously cherry picked, but the data support this law. The more syllables you have in a single structure, the shorter each of those syllables will be. And this is something that's been observed in language. As you see down here, once you get to a sort of 3 syllable word like strong boxes, you're not going to have internally syllables that are packed full of sounds like this one here, strengths. in fact, I mean, if from memory, certainly in genetics, people have pointed to Menzel's law applying there, where you're getting larger structures made out of smaller structures, and the more you pack into a single larger structure, the smaller each individual structure has to be. Good. Okay. And then I think in terms of time, yeah, we already made the point here about Zipf's law. And then one other final kind of dependency relation, which I hope would be interesting to you, is the following. So it helps us understand how population size is not just this kind of incidental fact about language. So I think if you talk to a 20th century linguist and you ask them, does it make any difference if a language is spoken by, 100 speakers or 1 million speakers, they'd probably, not have a hypothesis about that. They probably would not expect that it did make much difference. But a lot of work's been done on that question more recently, and it's now known that, if a language is spoken by 100 speakers and another language is spoken by 1 million speakers, you can make some pretty good predictions about what the differences between those languages are going to be without knowing any other information about them. So a really simple example would be, if I told you that one of the languages has a 2-term demonstrative system, which is like English, this, that, and one of the languages has 5-term demonstrative systems, like this language here that I work on in Laos. So it means something like this, that, yonder, the one up there, the one down there. I would bet a large sum of money that the language spoken by 1 million people has only 2 terms, and the language spoken by 100 people has 5 terms. That's a very robust kind of finding. And there's a bunch of other ones that have now been found to hold between size of population and quite specific structural properties about language. And that's a really fascinating field for study. All right, so I want to kind of move towards wrapping up now. After kind of bombarding you with tons of data and kind of just factoids about scale variance and scale dependency in language, it kind of reflects what I've been trying to do in this project, is sort of immerse myself in trying to understand what scale variance is possible within language systems. And that's kind of mostly what the review is about, but it ends on some speculations about how we might, where we might go from that and how we might think about understanding it. And so for that, I want to come back to the work by Jeffrey West et al., who looked at kind of a unifying explanation for why we see scaling variance of the kind that we see in cities and trees and mammalian bodies and so forth. So bringing you back to the sublinear scaling, the three-quarter power scaling that they found in cities and mammals and trees and so on, and they had this theory. The explanation boils down to 3 factors, and you want to think about this in relation to any distributional network system. So what these mammals and trees and cities all have in common is that they are systems that distribute something throughout a space by using a network where that network is branching, and it branches from large to smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And it has these 3 features. It optimizes the costs of that delivery. It fills the space, for example, the full body of the animal, and it has what's called an invariant size terminal function. So let me just sort of illustrate. So you can imagine an oil delivery network, global oil delivery network. So it has these massive sort of conduits, oil tankers. All this stuff gets refined in these massive facilities. But however big or small the place where you live, ultimately, if we're talking about gasoline distributional systems, they have to terminate at a certain point, the whole entire infrastructure is there to land at this terminal point. And the terminal point in the gas station is, what you're seeing on the screen here now. It's this nozzle that gets inserted into a car that's been designed to receive that nozzle. And so that's what's called the invariant terminal functional point in the distributional system. If you look at the West et al. Work, they have a very specific argument about why that's important. And what I want to do here is speculate on what kind of thing that will be for language. So the three factors to repeat are the system will be optimizing, it will be space filling, and it will have an invariant size terminal function. So let's just take those one by one. With language, optimization there's not a lot to say about it because it's actually very well understood and a lot of work is being done on it. It's very clear that, like anything else in human behavior and performance, we try to minimize effort. And there's a trade-off between minimizing effort for, adequately achieving the goal. And in language, the goal is typically, interpreted by the other person. And so optimizing that trade-off has been really fundamental in linguistic explanation for many decades, at least where people care to think about language behaviorally. If maybe that's something that we could discuss. David mentioned Skinner earlier on, so that may be kind of relevant here. So that's optimization. In terms of space filling, when we talk about things like, fuel delivery in a city, blood delivery in a body, space filling means, you have a defined space and it has to be filled. With language, that's a harder thing to answer. And there's, I think the main thing to think about here is the social network that language has to fill. There are at different scales, different time scales and different sort of causal domains. You could also say, well, language has to fill the time that's available during an interaction. So I think it's a sort of interesting open question about what space language fills. But the third one then now we can turn to finish is the question about what is the invariant terminal functional structure. So I gave you in the example of the gas stations, I gave you the gasoline nozzle going into the car. Coming again back to West's work, the story there about the relation between body mass and metabolic rate was based on the idea that whether you are a shrew or a blue whale, your aorta is going to be massively different in scale, but the terminal points of your blood distribution system are going to be pretty much the same. And that's going to be, the cells to where the ATP conversion has to take place and so forth. Power, electricity distribution, same thing. You've got an invariant terminal functional structure. It doesn't matter if you're in a skyscraper or a cottage. You've got to get that electricity into the same type of plug where I can charge my phone and so forth. So that's had me thinking a lot about language as a distributional system where the delivery to a terminal functional structure sets interesting constraints on how the different features of language can be scaled. And the answer that I've come down to is the intonation unit, the idea that I've emphasized a couple of times in talking today, that there's this quite low scalable, almost non-scalable kind of window of 2.5 seconds that serves as the kind of delivery point. It's like the tray, the opening, the window through which any given action made out of language gets delivered. So when people are talking, like these guys having a conversation, or, I'm delivering these remarks, each sort of move, each advance in the delivery of information and the delivery of action is being done through these steps, which take place at roughly 2.5 second kind of steps. So this is actually the next kind of big part of this project that I'm involved in right now. I've written a draft that kind of lays out the properties of this window, which I call the anchronic window. That's a paper that's currently under review and of course beyond our scope today. So that just leaves me time to conclude, and that's to say that I think thinking in this way in scalar terms is something that fits very well with exploring the concept of language as a complex system. We see that there's all these dependencies between subsystems, which I think have been studied very widely in sort of twos and threes, but it's like the blind people and the elephant. People aren't trying to sort of really connect them all together just yet, and I think that's what's really on our list of things to do. And I wouldn't want to say that a language is an organism. I see that more as a metaphor. But what I think is useful is thinking about language as something that travels along a network of processes that terminate in the distribution of speech acts, of social actions that take place at the sort of the nozzles, if you like, the delivery nozzles of social networks where social life gets played out. So that's where I'm at, and I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing the screen just so that I can see you and you can see me, and I'll be very keen to hear your comments and suggestions.
That was great, and great, Nick. Very mind-expanding. And so, yay, we get to ask questions. And my policy is to ask the fourth question, never the first. And so please raise your hands to queue up for questions. So many things to talk about. So who would like to go first? And let's open your camera up if you would, so we can actually see each other. Paul.
Well, I can kick off. I'm just still formulating it a little bit, but one of the theories that's influenced me a lot about language, and David mentioned at the beginning, is a thing called relational frame theory, which is a behavioral theory deriving originally from Skinner's attempts to understand verbal behavior. But then it basically sees language as a whole lot of behaviors, relating behaviors. And it has that scaling quality to it in the sense that if you've got, two relationships that they can only be held in a particular way, but if you've got 100 of them, then there's an exponential increase in the number of possible relationships that can occur between those items in the language. I noticed that relating or relationships between, so to give you an example of the sort of thing I'm talking about, naming a word, like naming an object, is a relationship between the symbol and the object. But then we have a lot of relations built into the language itself. So we say something is on something else, and the relationship between the subject and the object and so forth. Relations don't seem to figure at all in your conversation. And I'm just wondering whether there's some aspect of that last piece that you were just focusing on that might be about the relational space. Does that make sense as a question? I'm not sure if you can...
maybe I can clarify.
Yeah,
perhaps I didn't use the word relational or relationship very much, but that's not really reflective of what I've thought about. So I wrote a book in 2013 called Relationship Thinking, and it was, so it was very much about putting that at the sort of at the foreground, the core of how I want to think about language, because it's really all about any move that you make in language is forging or enacting a relationship. And so any sort of structural piece of language is a tool for doing that, or is an outcome of having done that historically. So thinking relationally is really certainly very much at the core of what I think about. And so you're right that those last remarks I made go to the core of that I think that you know, the structural observations about language ultimately you won't be able to make sense out of them until you see them as you know, tools for coordination, basically. And coordination is essentially a relational thing. So it's a triadic kind of vision, right? So you've got there's some words, but they are really just a way of getting you and me to align in some way, and that may be through, you know, updating you with information, or it may be through getting us to affiliate, or whatever, you know, whatever the function is. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm going to break my own rule, but please, others, raise your hand to queue up. But I think your talk illustrates and the mapping of, you know, how biological systems are studied and how linguistic systems are studied, I think is, you know, super important. And the way you began your talk reminds me of how much evolutionary analysis writ large, depending upon what scale it's taking place, either forefronts adaptation or not. So adaptationism in evolutionary biology requires a certain scale. Basically, the more you get it, the more we're speaking of microevolution, then the more adaptation and natural selection comes to the fore. The more a species is the focus, as a functionally organized unit, that adaptation comes to the fore. If you're a biologist like Jeffrey West, and you're looking at scaling laws, these are broad parameters of, you know, physical systems that life must abide by. If you want to be the size of an elephant, then you have to have the legs of a certain size and all of that sort of stuff. But that's at a scale which is not really, I mean, so much adaptation takes place within those parameters, within those scaling parameters, which is left unaddressed by the scaling parameters. And by the same token, complex adaptive systems, that concept just includes so much. And I was happy when you said that saying everything is interdependent just gets you nowhere, because what do you do with that? So, so even from a biological perspective and macroevolution, the more you're talking about macroevolution, it's a historical process, and, you know, adaptation is figuring in at every step along the way. But so many other things are taking place, including environmental events like meteors and stuff like that, that the adaptationist signal gets lost. So all of that, I think, applies to language. So that's super interesting in order to do that mapping. But to get to where I really want to go, if we wanted to study language in a way that maximized its functional nature, we would be studying it at a very small scale. Let's begin with the individual person and how language is figuring in that person's negotiation, or you might say dialectic, with their environment. Genetically, if we were to do that genetically, then a single person would have a genotype, a collection of genes. Those genes would be interacting with each other and with their environment. They'd be switching on and off. We've got all sorts of neat epigenetic stuff, and all of that would be enabling it to survive and reproduce in its environment. And those genes would be part of a local gene pool, which were compatible and so on and so forth. So, you know, the individual and its gene pool, you might say, its local gene pool, would be the unit in which adaptation would be most salient. The linguistic counterpart to that would be, once again, the individual person. And this is where relational frame theory, because it comes from a therapeutic tradition, is kind of centered. We're asking how individuals use language in order to navigate their environment and speak with their immediate associates. And it's there where you're going to get, like, most shared word usage and associations and so on is going to be most shared and coherent. So I did a big download onto you, and I appreciate that, you know, the talk that you gave, which was awesome, is only a small fraction of what you do. So I think maybe much of what I said is already familiar to you and something you address in your other books or so on. But I'm just interested to hear what you think about all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I take the second thing first. I mean, I think you mentioned the individual, and I think you know, it's coming back to Paul's comments. I've actually, I mean, the point of that earlier work on sort of relational thinking was about saying it's the dyad, it's the two-person enaction of a relationship that is the unit that you want to think about. So that any bit of language, so I've kind of tried to critique in the Language versus Reality book, I sort of critique, if you just look at cognitive science, people talking about what is language, and they'll say, oh, language allows you to create a link between your mind and the world, right? So you can refer to an object and you can refer to, something that's going to happen tomorrow or whatever. And my, what I like to say is to sort of quote people like, Lewis or Schelling, who are sort of thinking about sort of strategy and coordination, and point out that no, it's not that, you wouldn't need language to set up some sort of relation between yourself and the world. That's what we have perception for, right? Language is about setting up a coordination with another person around some aspect of the world. So it's really necessarily a minimally not individual, but relational in that exact sense. And why? Well, because language is public, right? So you don't need your categories. You need categories to interact with the world because they help you, predict and throw away unnecessary information and so on. But you can use that just privately, right? It's just between you and the world. But why do we have the public categories of language? It's because the actual function is coordination. It's dyadic relational coordination. So that's why I want to say that this thing in the other paper I call the enchronic envelope, that envelope is a moment at which we forge a joint attention and we have some kind of joint commitment to coordinating around some aspect of the world. So that'd be the place where I'd start. It's very important to the individual, obviously, but I'd want to say the unit of analysis is not the individual. It is the coordination it's the act of creating coordination between two individuals around some aspect of reality. So that's one. And then you said the thing about adaptation. I was interested to kind of come back to you and say, well, I wanted to get you to clarify. You were saying, scale, thinking about scale and going up and down in scales. One of the things you encounter in the scaling literature is this idea of sort of scale-free structures. So you see like fractal structures. You see the same structure at a tiny scale and a large scale. And oftentimes that's just not true, right? So I think that's what you're getting at, is that certain things just don't happen at higher scales and they do happen at lower scales. And that's what you suggested for adaptation. And I wanted to ask you, is that because different adaptations are really calibrated to specific environments, so that they're really, the question then becomes, well, that adaptation is only going to happen at the environment at which, in an environment of this particular scale. And once you get into a different environment, whether that environment is the human brain, so for language, the environments might be the brain, the air between us, a book, any physical instantiation of the language process. So yeah, that's sort of going back to the first point that you asked about adaptation. I'd want to know if your remarks were really based on this question of what environment the adaptation was to.
Gosh, well, there's so much to unpack there. And I wanted to walk back when we talk about scale independence. It just struck me as something that's a pretty important part of our own framework, is that the governance principles for groups is scale independent. So if you look at what's needed for cooperation to take place in a small group, and that's also true for the nations in the global village, how those principles get implemented, those are very scale dependent. So what you need to do in a small group in order to implement these functional principles is different than as the group becomes larger. You have to implement all kinds of structures in order to stay the same, basically. So there's interesting considerations there. So one thing I wanted to pick out, but please, then I want to just turn to others, is that your point about individuals and the relational nature of language, I don't think this is incompatible, but I think that given that there's so many different ways to perceive the world, that I think cultural constructions conveyed through language are important for the individual, that there would be a paralysis. I mean, there's just so many different things to attend to that unless you have some meaning system, as we put it, that is actually telling you what to pay attention to, first of all, what to notice and how to process it, then I think the individual would be paralyzed by that very interdependence that we've been talking about. And then to some extent, that's an individual construction, but for the most part, it's a cultural construction. So something which is relational is now being employed by the individual, but conveyed by language probably for that individual. So that, it seems to me, makes these symbolic systems conveyed largely through language very important at the individual level. And of course, it's also social and relational. Would that be pretty well accorded with the way you'd put it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it seems to me what you're talking about there is an adaptation by the individual to the cultural context. And I mean, it's always worth pointing out that one of the special things about humans is that process of individual learning is very extended. We have this massively long and costly socialization process, and so as a little kid, you just you haven't done all of that yet, and you do all this inappropriate stuff, and you don't know how to coordinate with people properly, and there's nothing like that in other species at that sort of scale. So I think we absolutely do adapt to and kind of constrain ourselves and allow ourselves to be focused individually around all of those culturally developed kind of landmarks for coordination. But it takes it's very secondary, and it takes a massive amount of sort of work and effort. It kind of reminds me of a Vygotskian view of, how the mind is sort of built around social interaction. We could come to some more of those points, but I see that David has his hand up.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sure.
hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, just this idea of coordination between individuals. In networks, you also have a lot of differences in terms of dominance, subordination, people trying to influence each other in ways against their own interests. And I'm just wondering if you take all that kind of stuff into consideration. A lot of times in network analyses, I think there's never recognition of free riders often. Everyone's sort of viewed as individuals interacting with each other like physical atoms.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I've actually been thinking a lot about networks lately, and there is this objection, that you raise, that people sort of say, well, it's, you talk about networks is very mechanistic. It's like we're like billiard balls or, atoms or whatever, and it's very mechanical. I don't think those are necessary, implications of thinking in network terms. I mean, I think that if you think that way through using networks, then you're doing it wrong in a certain sense. That I think it's not a necessary outcome of thinking in network terms. But I think that the answer is to think about how, a little bit to what we were just discussing about how a person has to get calibrated to all of the local anchors for coordination. So basically learning a culture, learning a language is learning all the coordination devices, right? So do we drive on the left side of the road or the right? And all of the equivalents of that for kind of social norms. So because we're not just thinking about, a dyadic relation in a very simple sense between two nodes in a network, but we're thinking about a set of norms that have been accumulated through time that then become part of the common ground. Exploitation is absolutely possible in the sense that you mean that. So we get, and one thing that's important to me about this envelope idea for social interaction is the following. Every time you have an interaction with a person, you're not just sort of sending a piece of information, you're engaged in a joint commitment, right? So that person is attending to you. You cannot you cannot have a speech act without the other person paying attention to you, right? As a basic requirement. So to create that 2.5 seconds of mutual attention and joint commitment, that in itself is already got a lot of buy-in, and it's also quite unequal because you have one person is the sort of director, the sender, you know, the agent, and the other one is the sort of one who's paying attention and all of that. You have some very important inequalities that are structured into how that whole thing works. So just the very fact that you are jointly committed to the interaction means that all of that power play is on the table, right? So it's really not like just randomly like light comes and hits me and now I've received the light, you know, that I am an agent and I'm a mind and I have to actually actively play a part in receiving that message in some sense. So that my view of kind of how interaction works at the core of all of this is it's very much not a sender-receiver type of model. It's very much a joint commitment, joint action kind of model. And so that's what I think, that has a very natural link in my mind to the sort of micropolitics that perhaps you're alluding to. Does that help?
Yeah. It also raised my interest in cognition is often separated from emotion. Some people think you can't separate them. So all this conversation is, you know, creating emotions, and there's emotional contagion going on and things like that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I think so. My larger kind of model of all of this is you know, I've drawn a lot of inspiration from bias transmission kind of models. You know, I don't know, Boyd and Richardson and millions of others, thinking about how, you know, we've got big networks, we've got innovations and knowledge and ideas being distributed. And while they might not talk about emotions very much, I mean, I think it's very, there's a very obvious way in which those things can be understood to be part of that whole account through providing biases on transmission. So, you know, whether you will learn something, how you will learn that thing, whether you're likely to produce that behavior yourself in the future, all of these things are going to be affected by, you know, did it make sense to you? Could you process it? But also, you know, did it freak you out? Did you get a shot of dopamine or some other drug when that interaction occurred? So I think all of those things are part of the many biases on transmission. And I don't just mean biases on learning. I mean, you know, the flow through culture of any kind of practice or any kind of behavior. Am I going to repeat that in the future? Is important for evolution, and it's I think directly affected by things like my emotional state as well as my cognitive state.
Yeah, I really want to get one more big question to you, Nick, if we can hang on for just a little bit longer.
Yeah, I'm fine. I know we're past time, but I'm free.
Strictly speaking, we're at time. But I want to talk about let me begin with Atlas Shrugged, since you brought in Atlas Shrugged. And if you take a book like that, it's an explicit attempt to convey a moral worldview as a kind of paradigmatic way of viewing the world. Ayn Rand said, art is the indispensable medium for communicating a moral ideal. And so here we have this elaborate cultural construction, which hangs together in a way that if you take it on, if you take it seriously, if you accept it, basically, it really does organize your world in a way that motivates a certain suite of actions. And so that comparison between something inside your head, in this case, the worldview of Ayn Rand, and something outside your head, how you actually perceive the world and process the information and how you act in it, which has huge emotional component, by the way, is the way to look at that particular worldviews and worldviews in general. So if we look at alternative worldviews, more cooperative ones, and so on and so forth, what you'll find is that they're also constructions conveyed through language, which are, if they're well done, either through the artistry of an individual person or a selection process, what you find is that they're very effective at organizing perception and then motivating a certain suite of actions. And so in my work, whether I describe it as linguistic research or not, I think it's very much a matter of this paradigm, this configuration of ideas, this configurations of ideas that hang together, and in a way that really is consequential in terms of what it causes you to do, is a very important unit. And of course, in a prescriptive sense, then it's just we want to create one of them, which is capable of motivating worldwide cooperation. So the paradigm, the core configuration, the worldview, our vocabulary, the meaning system, our vocabulary is quite crude for identifying what this thing is, but it's a really important thing, and it is communicated through language. It has a degree of integrity that is impressive, and so on. So, what do you think about that unit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's so that the Atlas Shrugged. I mean, another example would be the Bible. One thing I'd want to say about this would be that a lot of the power that you describe is almost independent of the actual content. So, you know, do you have to have read 560,000 words of that book to, you know, for those consequences to be played out in your life? You know, maybe not, right? So maybe you're just actually interacting with behavior that was inspired by that, or, you know, so there's all of these kind of wave effects where you might point to the unit of being, you know, here's this text. But very often, so it's an interesting analogy might be things like the role of books in independence movements. So like histories of certain, you know, minority cultures or grammars, dictionaries, you know, these books, you can hold them up. And so there's a sense in which they become these symbols in a classic sense of, you know, in sort of, they'd be metonyms in kind of semiotic jargon, that they small things that stand for the ideas. So you don't have to actually read the dictionary for the dictionary to be a powerful symbol of, you know, your existence. So we exist, we have a right to autonomy because look, we've got our own language. And it's I think, so it's the discourse around that document. And I think with the Atlas Shrugged case, it'd be the same. Of course, you can.
It would be like you get the big book, but you also get the memes. Greed is good. Who is John Galt? So there's the short version that kind of prompts the larger version.
Exactly. So, but those things, the memes, I think that's where the money is. I mean, that is where. I mean, it's an open question, and I suppose to really look at it, you'd want to look at things like, you know, to what extent is there substance behind those memes that gives them the power that they have, you know? So it's like money that is backed up by gold lying in Fort Knox. You know, we all know that the book is there, it's on the shelf. I've never read it, but I know greed is good. You know, and I know I can go read it if I need to, type of thing. So I think there might be an element in play of something a little bit similar to honest signaling, where you know, that book, the person who wrote it, you know, it's a very costly book, right? In the sense that, you know, there's 560,000 words that someone has to read, and so I've actually read it. I put in the days. I've paid that cost. Or at least a lot of other people have, or at least if I really want to back up my little meme of greed is good, I know I can, there's a very deep well where that is all fleshed out, just like in the Bible, right? So that I feel like there'd be some element of kind of second or third hand honest signaling somehow. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Where you know, flippant remarks just don't have that kind of that heavy cost that's been paid somewhere in the past.
Yeah, we have a associate named Christopher Spain who's not here, but he's actually calculated, you know, the number of hours that have gone into the writing of a book, and just look at the cost benefit ratio from the standpoint of the storyteller, not the listener who's imbibing it, but the guy who spent 20,000 hours writing the book that probably won't be read by anyone. What's the you know, what's the incentive, that urge to tell that story? It's it's quite an interesting perspective, Paul.
It's not a follow-up to that, so I'm wondering if Nick has a response. I have a different question altogether.
No, happy to go to another question. I just maybe a quick remark is that I think, I mean, worldview is something that's really intrigued me, and I think that there are part of what holds a worldview together is, you know, there's some logical kind of consistency in some sense, but again, I think that something like commitments and costs are part of it. And so when you're committing to a certain worldview, you're necessarily committing not to hold all these other worldviews, right? So there's a very, you know, there's a sort of a cost. There's a cost in that sense. So like, I'm a greed is good person, therefore I can't be a, you know, all these other types of people. And once I make that public, so there's a strong potential cost in terms of identification. So who I am and who I am to you and all of that. So that's a huge part of this, I think. And so, you know, consistency plays a role, but it's not just some kind of psychological or logical consistency. We all know we don't really need that or have that. But I think it's part of again, some kind of honest signaling or commitment that information allows us to display. So Paul, yeah.
So totally different thing. You showed a slide partway through where you had the subject, verb, object distributions around the world. And looking at that slide, it looked to me like they were pretty evenly spread, which was surprising to me because maybe they're not, but I would have thought that languages would have grown out of other languages in particular regions, and so there would have been more clustering of it. Could you say a little bit about how that happens and why that happens?
I think the clusterings are easy. I'm just going to get the slide because I think the clustering is not that evenly spread. I'll just share real quick. Can you see it?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. I mean, I guess it's hard for me to tell what the clustering is like. I guess there's
I mean, it's just that each color is one of the three possible orders, and you see, sure, there's green all over the world, but that's because green and blue are all over the world, and they happen to be the most frequent, so that, you know, they vastly outnumber the rest. So where are you going to fit them all? That, you know, they get put around the world. But one of the, I suppose, the factor that I didn't really mention, although I might have just implied it in passing, as you can see, the two, these two very high bars, those are the orderings that have the subject in the first position. So the argument there is this is the most cognitively natural way.
Yeah, functional constraints.
Of organizing the information. So it basically says there's an independent or history independent reason to prefer those two orders, which is basically a psychological, there's a cognitive argument which says, you know, let's establish the subject first, and that's better for information flow, and it's just a more natural solution to this coordination problem. And so it comes not from historical facts, but simply from just the fact we all have human brains, and this is the preferred way. So that's a big part of the explanation in the literature that I didn't really mention here, is that there's some cognitive naturalness to certain types of linguistic solutions, and that again, going back to a bias transmission view, that's like a kind of a content bias. It's more easily processed, it's more effective, so we gravitate towards that.
So let me flip the question on its head then. Why would there be any diversity from that? That seems like a big constraint to me, to identify the subject first. And then I was looking particularly at Australia, as I'm sure you would as well, and looking at the Indigenous languages, and they're wildly variant from that. So, and there might be a couple that are just in some region that are quite different. How does that occur? Like, I'm sort of imagining some little group just says, wow, we're going to speak completely differently to what we've heard from some other group,
Yeah, well, I mean, there are competing motivations and competing causal factors. And so one of them is cognitive naturalness. Another one is just, there are certain historical paths that these different solutions can evolve out of. So, you have, I don't know. So how to do this quickly. Word order is one way of figuring out in a simple sentence who's doing what to whom. So if I say Kim saw you, we need to know who was it, Kim who saw you or you who saw Kim. Well, English, we rely on word order. That's no problem. But there are other ways to do it, right? So in another language, you might have a little affix on the word Kim, which says Kim was the one who did the seeing, and you have another affix on you, and that means you were the one who got seen. And then if we have that system in place, word order is much less important for sort of figuring out.
You've done it another way, more than one way to skin a cat.
Yeah, exactly. So there are three basic ways. And so there are, these things can therefore take up more functional load. So English has very little, English actually, we don't want to get into a linguistics seminar here, but basically the answer is, there are other ways of solving that basic coordination problem around, basic things like who are we talking about and what is, who did which action. And that means that essentially, if you know, for example, that a language doesn't have the subject in its first position, you can be pretty sure it's got other things going on in its grammar, which aren't mentioned in this, very high level kind of ordering question. It would have affixes of some kind on the verb or case markers on the noun or something like that.
Yeah,
and that would,
I think.
Yeah, that would just help to explain how you could get a sort of a slightly counterintuitive, structure, evolving in a certain kind of context.
I think it's very, back to the biological analogies. Convergent cultural evolution is like convergent genetic evolution. You get functional convergence in functional design to a degree. But in fact, just look at it a little bit more closely and you find differences, which are basically historical differences. So that I think that's very comparable, it seems to me.
Can I just remark, I did notice that in the chat there were a couple of questions.
Sure.
And so let me just look at them. So one question, isn't the cause, this is about language's vocab size, isn't the cause also some type of cumulative advantage due to language of trade / colonialism? I think the answer, trade, colonialism, any kind of intercultural contact obviously brings in, and I suppose development and this kind of thing. I mean, wherever you have a situation where you've got to name new things, where you're going to get more words, right? And it's for the reasons I said before. It's not just because you've learned a new object, but because you have to coordinate with others around that. So you may want to buy one or learn how to make one or give one to someone or say that you've seen one. So it's definitely the case that kind of cultural experience and cultural change leads to change in vocab size. And then the other question is, I'll just read it, is how scaling in these terms has meaningful limits in claims as we approach the human world due to politics and other complex techno-social cultural factors. E.g., recent research disproves or clarifies that the per capita income increase of city scale is due to cumulative advantage benefiting the few at the expense of the many, with the implication that making cities better is not just about size, but requires various redistribution schemes to level or counter the inequality. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. So in the scale literature, there's a lot of discussion around what's it called? There's a technical term for this, but it's often called it's preferential attachment is what it's called. And it's often just called the rich get richer principle. And that is that, there are certain network topologies that are natural that emerge out of the way that networks grow. And one of those structures is that one node will often draw many, many links, and the more links it has, the more links it draws as the system grows. And so you get monopolies, and you get connectors, and you get nodes within the network become very powerful. And when that has to do with the flow of capital, then of course you're getting monopolization, and you're getting Apple and Google and all the rest. Socially, at a much lower level, you're getting the phenomenon of big men and connectors, and people who are the sort of conduits for innovation and that sort of stuff. So I think that in answer to that question, there are winners and losers. When scale changes and you get reconfiguration of network topologies, it just has all these consequences for flow. And certainly one of the risks is you're getting the preferential attachment and the rich get richer type of principle. But when that comes to financial or capital inequality, that has one set of consequences, but it might, in other kinds of contexts, the consequences might be beneficial, because it means that, for example, if somebody is an information broker, you know who to go to. It helps to solve a problem. So if I need to get a piece of information, I think we all know people who, if we've heard some edge of some gossip, well, we know who to go to get the information, right? We know certain people are more connected than others. So there are upsides and downsides to those inequalities. They often are ways of getting higher efficiency, but exactly as the question in the chat states, this is sometimes at the cost of some people over others.
Well, I think that this will be my final thought, and it reiterates what I said earlier about scaling laws, that they're very interesting to know about because systems have to operate within their boundaries. But it takes cities, for example. The smart cities movement seeks to make cities into functionally organized units as city level units. Many cities are not smart. Most cities are not smart. Right. And if they all obey some scaling law, well, that's just telling us that that's not identifying the distinguishing features between something we want to call smart and something we want to call dumb. So if they're all falling along some goddamn curve, so the scaling laws are great, but they're really not providing the toolkit we need often to ask the very, very practical question: how do we take this system, this human system, or this coupled human and natural system, and make it adaptive as a system? That's a specifically evolutionary question. It requires an evolutionary process, and yes, it must obey scaling laws. But there's where I think that in general, a problem with complex systems theory is that it is often physics-based, and we love to criticize economics for being based on physics when it should be based on evolution. Darwin, not Newton, we say, for neoclassical economics. But the same critique can be leveled against complex system science when it's in the hands of physicists. And so that integration between general complex systems theory, which applies to both living and non-living systems, and living complex systems theory, which is specifically evolutionary, that's an integration which is still in progress in general terms, and is therefore sure to be reflected in the study of language. So I think that's there that I just love the conversation we've just had, and I hope it continues. So I hope we find ways to basically stay in the same academic community and continue to interact.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I think one quick comment on what you've just said is I think that I always want to say something like, questions like efficiency, trade-offs, functions, they always have to be specific to some specified, reward function, if you like, that is usually not specified. So, when we say what's a good city, well, we typically have something in mind. Good for what? I mean, good in by what criterion? And it's going to be really good at something. So, you ask an AI, a stupid one, how to reduce pollution in the city, and they say, well, just kill all the humans. It would be fine. But so you have to have certain kind of things that you're not going to you got to specify what are your values, and I think that's part of what the problem is that you're referring to here, is that certain values are either not being specified, or if they were specified, they wouldn't be the same ones as this other group are arguing for. So it's a really critical part of resolving some of these kind of disputes. But so yeah, I also just want to say it was great, really incredibly stimulating Q&A. Thank you everybody for that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this work.
Great. Okay, we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much, and lovely for it to have been recorded.